Away with the Angels. Written by S. Thomas Thompson. Narrated by Amanda Harkett. Chapter 1.
"Mummy, mummy, mummy!"
Tommy shouted as he came out of the school gate. He was always excited to see her, but this day brought particular excitement. It was the first school day of the month, and their tradition was to go and get an ice cream on the beach. The small treats went a long way with the 6-year-old boy, Angelica thought. They walked down. She tried to walk as much as possible. In days gone by, she had a gym membership, joined exercise classes on the beach, and even hired a personal trainer for a while. But Angelica found that walking as much as possible was the best way for her to keep in shape. They said 10,000 steps a day. She usually got close to double that, so an ice cream every now and again wasn't going to cause too much of a problem. "What did you do at school today?" Angelica asked. Most of the time, Tommy couldn't remember. When he first returned from school with almost no memory of what had happened in the previous 6 hours of his day, Angelica worried. But speaking to the teacher and the other mums, she found out that this was typical. Their brains had gone from play to work, and the switch made them tired. Memories faded. As he got a little older, his recall got a little better.
"We learned about religion," he responded.
Sometimes he remembered the vague topic without much detail. "And what did you learn about religion?" she prompted, expecting not a great deal in return.
"There are many religions in the world," he answered,
sounding like a textbook rather than a child. "And can you name any religions?" she asked.
"Catholics are one, and there is one called Islam. Buddha has a religion."
"Very good. And are you religious?" she asked.
"I don't think we've been to church, Mummy."
"No, we haven't. But that doesn't mean we don't have any connection to all right and wrong. Religion is a set of rules that define what is right and what is wrong. It's a framework to live your life by. You and I have this framework, but we don't attach it to a particular religion. Does that make sense?"
"What's a framework?"
Tommy asked. "Like a set of rules."
"That makes sense, Mummy. Can I ask something?"
"Yes, of course," Angelica replied, looking down to his serious face while he walked and talked.
"Do all religions have angels?"
"I guess they all have something like angels, yes."
"And I have one more question."
"Go ahead, kidda."
"What flavour ice cream do you want?"
Angelica laughed. She wondered what went on inside Tommy's head. At least now she knew that ice cream was far up the list of things on his mind, especially on the first school day of the month. "I think I'd like to go for a fruity one this time," she responded. Tommy screwed his face up.
"When there's all the chocolate ones, why go for fruit?"
he asked with a disdain that went right through her. She knew his dislike for fruit. She didn't want it to become a dislike for people who ate fruit. "Well, what if your mummy decides that you have to have a fruit ice cream? What would you think about that?" she asked. He dropped his head. That was a punishment too far in his eyes. "What are you going to choose?" she asked, already knowing the answer.
"Double chocolate!"
he shouted back. The pair of them sat on the wall opposite the ice cream parlour, their feet dangling over the edge, the beach below enticing them to get on with their double scoop in a tub ice creams and feel the sand between their toes. "And did you do anything else at school today?" Angelica asked.
"I haven't finished talking about religion yet," he said indignantly.
"Go ahead."
"You know I sit next to Freya Gonzalez."
"Yes," Angelica responded, picturing the young girl. There were 3 Freyas in his class.
"Well, she is religious. She goes to the big church in the port."
"That's a lovely church. We've been in there when we first moved here just to have a look. That's really nice for Freya.
Freya says her mum will be an angel soon.
Angelica shook from head to toe. What do you mean?
I don't know. She just said her mum will be an angel.
Chapter 2. After Tommy went to bed, Angelica spent the evening trawling through Facebook, looking to see if there was any mention of an illness with Freya's mother. The comments Tommy had reported back to her got Angelica worried. She wanted to know what it was all about. All she knew about Tina, Freya's mother, was that she was a Brit like her, married to a Spanish man whose name she couldn't remember. Freya was an only child, something that was much more of a phenomenon than when Angelica was a child. In those days, everyone had at least one sibling, often two there or more. Kids in school had brothers or sisters in school. Teachers got to know whole families, but now an only child was much more the norm. She would love to have given Tommy a brother or sister, but it just didn't work out that way. One child with Patty, Tommy's dad, was enough. His controlling ways turned to violence. He wasn't someone she wanted another kid with, and there hadn't been anyone else. The Facebook profile of Tina Gonzalez, that was her surname, was public. You could see everything she did, all her connections and every single thing she posted on the site, and there was no indication that she was anything other than happy and well. All the pictures were of a smiling Tina, a smiling Freya, and a smiling Dante, the name of her husband and Freya's father she had gleaned from the publicly accessible information on the social media site. The smiles were gleaming white, a reminder that Dante was a cosmetic dentist for a living. They went on many days out, to the caves in nearby Benaldoig, the beaches up and down the coast, and sometimes out to the big city just up the road in Valencia. Angelica wondered what Freya meant by the comment. Maybe it was a private conversation between her and her mother, words that meant something special to them, but could be misconstrued by anyone else. Maybe. Angelica loved and loathed social media in equal measure. Here she was, nearly midnight, and she hadn't done any of the tasks she had planned for the evening. Tommy's school clothes weren't ironed. The washing up from their tea was still sat by the sink. The downstairs of their duplex apartment needed hoovering. Well, she couldn't get the hoover out at that time of night. It was just time for the washing up and sorting out his school clothes. Chapter 3. The next morning, Angelica and Tommy set off for school. She had too many errands to do straight after school to walk this time. She had some parcels to get back to the UK for upcoming birthdays, and then there was the small matter of her residency in the country. Angelica had been told by an English friend that she needed to complete some paperwork regarding staying longer than a few months at a time, something to do with the EU rules now the UK had enacted Brexit. She thought that meant leaving Brussels red tape behind, and the last thing on her list, which was the first thing she would do, was to buy some new ornaments for the home. It felt more sparse the longer she spent there. Time to put some personal touches on the place and make it feel like a home that could only belong to her and Tommy. So, they set off in the car. They left just as early driving as they did to walk, because of the issues getting parked. The sun was low, shining directly into her face. Angelica had forgotten her sunglasses. She usually had a spare pair in her car, but had sat on them a few days earlier, rendering them useless. She tried in vain to make something workable of them, but they looked like a mangled wreck. Too much pressure trying to return one arm to its rightful place had caused the metal to shear. Only good for someone with one ear and eyes that weren't on the same level, Angelica thought, as she assessed the mess she'd made of the repair. The traffic was light. It still hadn't got to the high season. Instead of masses of summer traffic, it was mainly the locals going backwards and forwards on the roads of Javier that morning. She had chosen it as a place to live on a whim, hearing only good things about the town from a distant relative back at home. When Tommy's dad became too much and she just had to get out of the country, it was the first place that popped into her head. And it was perfect, big enough to get lost in if needed, small enough to get to know people. Angelica quickly made friends from the group of mums at the nursery school Tommy attended, although the group had narrowed somewhat over the previous year. One of the group had killed another over a business deal gone wrong. But the rest of them were a tight-knit group, all looking out for each other, even if their busy lives didn't allow for much more than their usual Saturday afternoon get-together. Angelica was on red alert as she drove to the school and parked. There were 2 reasons for this. One that she always had with her, and one that was new for that day. She was always on red alert at the school. Life had taught her this lesson many years earlier. One of her best friends at primary school was hit by a car when they were leaving school one day. Ellie missed 18 months of school and returned paralysed. Angelica felt some guilt about how she didn't save her friend, even though there was no way she could have predicted an idiot driver, late to pick up his kid, racing around a blind corner at 40 miles per hour on the curb. There was no way Angelica was going to carry the guilt of knocking a child over with her for the rest of her life. The second reason was that she was on the lookout for Tina Gonzalez. If there was something wrong, then her social profile didn't indicate it, and if she needed help, Angelica would always be one of the first to offer it. She crawled the streets near the school, looking for that elusive parking space, and that equally elusive Tina. Angelica found the first, but not the second. She walked Tommy into school, kissing him on the forehead before he walked off to his friends. Angelica took the long route back to her car with the express intention of seeing Tina Gonzalez, but there was no sign of her at all. Angelica climbed onto the driver's seat of her car, started the vehicle, and checked both ways to see if there were any children crossing near her. The coast was clear. She pulled out, indicating, and started the drive to the port. As she pulled around a corner, Angelica spotted Tina getting out of her car with Freya. She craned her neck to try to see what car Tina and Freya had got out of, but it wasn't clear. There was a line of traffic behind her, so Angelica couldn't stop or get out. She watched Tina stroll along the street, seemingly without a care in the world. She looked well. Angelica was comforted by this fact, whatever it was. Tina Gonzalez. Chapter 4. Angelica parked at the port. The early summer weather had brought out hundreds of people, all milling around at the cafes, restaurants and shops in the pretty port area of Javier. The most popular spot to see and be seen was the promenade at the front, where cafes arranged tables on both sides of the walkway. You had the choice of being as close to the seawall as possible or on the opposite side of the walkway where you could see everything was there to be seen. A coffee played on her mind, but she decided to park that thought. Something told her that she would get the opportunity to sit down with a nice drink later in the day. She walked along the row of shops that were being passed by as the others congregated around the port area were flocking to the front. She liked to zig when the world zagged. It gave her the feeling that she was doing her own thing, not herded by the way the rest of them were acting. She had eyed up a few ornaments in the weeks prior in one of the nicer shops in the port. The collection of outlets ranged from the functional to the higher end. If she really wanted something uber expensive, then she would have to venture much further, probably to the shops in Alicante or Valencia. But she didn't have the time nor the budget for that. Walking into the shop, she was immediately entranced by the items contained within. She loved everything in there, from the citrus-coloured kitchen implements to the gadgets that would toast a sandwich in seconds or make pasta that tasted like the stuff in the restaurants rather than the stuff in supermarkets. She looked out of the window at the early summer sun. It was more than welcome. It wasn't that the sun had disappeared for months before, the way that it did in the northeast of England. It was that the warmth signalled a new summer season. It was Angelica's favourite time of the year. People would flock to Javier from all over the world. Estate agents' offices would be packed as people fell in love with Javier as tourists and thought about becoming residents. This was when Angelica made her money. As a keen amateur photographer, she sold the odd image through her website. But when there were homes being sold, she was in much higher demand. She would take marketing images for estate agents, helping them to sell homes for a smallish fee. Another reason for the sunshine to bring a smile to her face. Back to the shopping, Angelica spotted a pair of vases. They had caught her eye before when she was window shopping. In red and blue, they were a pair but weren't identical. The aperture of the vases reached up into the sky as though they were trying to grab hold of something. They would be perfect to put small bunches of flowers in. Tommy was now old enough that he didn't crash into the furniture multiple times a day, so they wouldn't get knocked off and smashed. She decided that these were the perfect ornaments to embellish her home and make it more personal to Tommy and her. She looked around for a member of staff to help her. As she looked around the shop interior, Angelica's eyes met with someone else. Someone she knew. Someone that wasn't a member of staff at the shop. He walked towards her with an understated smile on his face. "Angelica!" he exclaimed, holding out his arms for a hug. "Javi!" she replied, reaching in for the hug. She felt safe in his arms. "How are you?" Javi asked. The man's full name was Javi Jones. His heritage a mix of Welsh and Spanish. He was the homicide detective at the local police station. Their paths had crossed the December before when Angelica and her brother Augustine found a body in the sea. Angelica got the detecting bug and helped crack the case. In truth, she had waited for another opportunity to do the same. Would anyone hire a photographer to solve murder cases on their behalf? Probably not. Immediately after the murder case, Angelica looked out for Javi every time she left her apartment. She would park as near as possible to the police station, walking slowly past the cafe where Javi, Augustine and Angelica had enjoyed a strong coffee. But to no avail. After a few weeks of this, she dropped back into her old life. She still had the inkling that she would get involved in detecting again, that she would meet Javi again. And here he was. "I'm good," she replied, still not letting go of him. He felt like a pillar of strength. He was like the safe man she needed when her ex, Patty, was beating her. Angelica knew that if Javi was in her life at that point in time, Patty wouldn't have got away with his nastiness. "Fancy a coffee?" he asked as they broke their hold. His skin smelled fresh, and there was something familiar about his aftershave. Chapter 5. Javi gave her the option of where to get a drink. She wanted to be sat on the front, looking out at the sea. As they walked and chatted, Angelica thought about Javi. He was a nice guy. She felt safe around him. but he wasn't ever going to be anything other than a friend. She felt nothing but platonic thoughts about him. The chat was natural. He asked how Tommy was. She asked about his family. He told her almost nothing about them. He mentioned a son. By the way he talked, the son sounded like he was either in adulthood or fast approaching it. She tried to imagine Javi as a father figure. He would be all the things that a son would need, she concluded. As it happened, Angelica fancied a cuppa, a pit stop before the rest of the planned activity of the day. She wasn't always a breakfast person. Before Tommy, she didn't eat it at all. But when he was born, she felt that she should be setting a good example. It came to her in many ways of life. She managed her fear of spiders so she didn't pass it on to him. She wore sunscreen for the first time in her life. And in terms of food, she moved from grazing whenever she felt hungry throughout the day to 3 square meals as soon as he was weaned. These felt like the right things to do. Angelica picked her favourite cafe, Naray. Not quite the same as you would get back in the UK, but a place that did a wicked cup of coffee, strong, full of flavour, and with a kick that would keep her going for hours before the caffeine crash later. Angelica had read that you should either drink coffee at the same time every single day or not at all. The body got into a cycle linked to the way the caffeine ebbed and flowed in the system. She wasn't that regular a drinker of the stuff. She knew that it would give her a high, followed by a low and then a craving at about the same time the next day. And she was prepared for that. "What do you want?" Javi asked. "Latte," she replied, not really knowing that much about coffee. Certainly not as much as a aficionado, that was for sure. She sat at the table. Javi went inside to order. Mostly you waited for someone from the cafe to come out and take your order, but Javi didn't seem to follow this convention, rushing into the cafe as soon as Angelica took her seat. Maybe he wanted to ensure that he paid, not entering into a conversation about who would get the bill at the end. Angelica saw him place a €10 bill on the counter and walk back out to the table near the sea wall. The tide was coming in at some rate. The sea splashed against the rocks below, sending spray up the side of the wall and into the air. The finest of sprays reached the promenade, refreshing people out for a walk in the morning sun that was starting to heat the area up to the mid-20s. He sat next to her, arching his body so they were eye to eye. She was more than comfortable with Javi. His manner was slightly awkward, but in a way that made you feel at home with him. Some people hide their discomfort deep below, putting out a sterile version of their inner self to the world. Javi was comfortable enough in his inner self to let all the quirks out. Angelica respected that. "How's business?" she asked in a vain attempt to ignite some conversation that might lead to her involvement in a murder investigation. She knew it was a long shot, but she enjoyed working with Javi and her brother Augustine the year before. Augustine was a murder detective himself, back in the UK. "It's really quiet. Things ramp up in the summer when the tourists arrive. We don't have many murders here in Javier. We're not a big city like Valencia or a den of iniquity like Benidorm, you know." He smirked. "It's one of the reasons I feel safe here," she responded, not letting on that he was the other reason she felt safe in Javier. Her hug might have given away that he was someone she felt safe around, but she wasn't going to verbalize it. The coffees arrived. She spotted that he'd chosen a cafe solo, the Spanish equivalent of an Italian espresso. It always struck her as a drink that people quaffed as a pure caffeine hit rather than anything to linger over. Javi looked at the coffee on the table, looked up at the waiter, and smiled. He enjoyed nothing more than a cafe solo in mid-morning, especially when he'd had an early start. Javi's narrow features squinted in the sunlight. he reached in his pocket for a pair of sunglasses. His outfit was always the same when the weather allowed. Khaki shorts and a sleeveless khaki jacket over a white t-shirt. He wore hiking boots, ready to get moving when the moment presented itself. His beard always looked unkempt. Angelica couldn't work out whether that was his style or if he just didn't pay much attention to it. She thanked the waiter, and then thanked Javi for the coffee. He nodded in return. "And you think you might stay in Javier for a while at least?" Javi asked awkwardly. He didn't know how to ask the question. Something inside him wanted her to stick around. Like Angelica, he didn't have romantic feelings for her, but felt himself in her company. "I can't see any reason to leave," she replied, just as the buzzing sound from his phone started. He looked around, found a spot where he could be on his own, and stepped away from the table. She listened as much as she could to his phone conversation. There were only the odd words she could pick up against the background of chatter from other people, the waves splashing against the rocks, and the hum of the air conditioning units on the roofs of the cafes. "Murder. Immediately. No help. Pain." There was a word that she couldn't quite put her finger on near the end of his conversation. She mulled it over in her head, but couldn't form it fully. Whatever it was, Angelica knew it would come to her later. "I have to go," Javi Jones said, reaching over and downing his cafe solo without getting back into his seat. "I'm sorry, but duty calls." She smiled back in his direction. She knew that his job meant he couldn't brush off work for a coffee with a friend. "Hopefully we'll see each other soon," she said with anticipation. As soon as the words came out of her mouth, she regretted it. The words sounded desperate, and that wasn't Angelica. He nodded in reply, smiling a bigger smile. Maybe it wasn't desperate. As Javi Jones walked off, the word that she had heard came to Angelica. Chapter 6. Angelica's excitement was something she needed to suppress. She knew where Javi Jones would come out of the street after leaving the police station. She was waiting. To cover herself, she'd pulled a jumper from the back seat over her t-shirt and ruffled her hair, pulling it all forward instead of the tied-back look she'd sported when talking to Javi a few minutes earlier. She was on a mission. She was going to follow Javi Jones to wherever he had been called to. The roads were filled with trucks heading along to the sea. It was at this time of year that Javier traffic turned into large vehicles preparing the town for the summer rush. Temporary beach bars were set up all along the front between the port and the Arenal. These helped cater for the massive increase in trade. The local businesses that ramped up massively in the summer, which were pretty much all of them, got their supplies delivered now ahead of demand. This ranged from the scuba centre to the pedalos along the beach, as well as the extra tables and chairs restaurants needed for their increased custom. It was like much of the town was put into hibernation, stored away until it was needed again. The place came to life in the summer, and this was the very beginning of it. She tracked the movements of Javi Jones. She had no idea where Tina Gonzalez lived, even if that was the Gonzalez that Javi's call referred to. It was a common name in Spain. She guessed that there were probably hundreds of people with that surname in Javier alone. Angelica stayed 3 or 4 cars back as much as she could, hoping to stay in the background and not indicate to the detective that he was being followed. She weaved in and out of traffic when he got too far ahead, dropping back and letting people out when she felt too close. As Javi Jones slowed down, checked something in his lap and pulled up on one side of a wide road, Angelica pulled up on the other, around 50 yards further back. She pulled the wonky sunglasses out of the glove compartment and sunk low into her seat so she couldn't be seen. The scene was already set as somewhere a crime had been committed. There was a large white van parked out the front, a hive of activity. The letters on the side of the van spelled out the word "Forens." Her Castilian hadn't made it as far as that particular piece of vocabulary, but she didn't have to be an expert to take a good guess at what it meant. People in white coats were in and out of the van, recovering sealed clear bags from the property and marching them to the back of the van before completing a form on a clipboard and going back into the property to retrieve something else of significance. Javi was talking to someone at the gate leading to a short path, at the end of which was the front door. As the people marched in and out, another figure appeared. He dropped his head, trying to shield his eyes from the sunlight. Most people would have raised their hands to shield their eyes from the glare of the sun that was shining directly at him. But this man couldn't do any such thing. He was handcuffed. The policeman escorting the handcuffed man from the property handed his arm to Javi Jones, who took him and led the man to a marked police car, minding his head as he placed him in the back. Angelica guessed this was Freya. Chapter 7. Angelica sat and looked up at the sky, a tear forming in the corner of each eye. She wondered how close she was to the same fate as Tina Gonzalez. Her ex, Patty, was a violent man towards her. In fact, as far as she could make out, he was a violent man towards all women. She had been beaten several times. The brutal pig that Patty was when he was one-on-one with her disappeared and was transformed into a jovial fellow when the police arrived to speak to him. She'd reported Patty to the police in England 4 times. On each of those occasions, he had charmed the police into believing that he was as calm as a Buddhist monk and wouldn't hurt a fly, let alone the mother of his child. They took it hook, line, and sinker. Angelica had to leave the country to get away from him. She looked at the property, knowing that the walls couldn't tell what happened within them. They couldn't tell of the verbal abuse that made the victim feel like they were worthless, a tiny speck of worthless matter on the sole of the shoe of humanity. The walls couldn't tell of the physical violence enacted by the aggressor. Patty would hit her where he didn't leave marks. Her internal organs must have taken one hell of a beating, because she ached for days in agony without so much as a bruise to show for her pain. They couldn't tell of the choice Angelica was given by her despotic ex, a choice of whether to take the beating herself or pass it on to Tommy. That was what he'd said to her, those exact words. Angelica closed her eyes and went to a happier place. In fact, her happy place was the place she was in at that moment. Javier. She'd gone there without much knowledge of the place and found a paradise. Away from Patty, away from all of those memories. It was a heavenly change to the drudgery of life with Patty in the northeast of England. As well as being away from him, she was also somewhere surrounded by friends. She couldn't have those with Patty, and with a lack of rain well over 300 days a year. As she sat there with her eyes tightly closed, thinking of how happy Tommy and she had become, she had felt the heat of the sunshine on her face through the side window. It was going to be a sunny day. Another one. She thought about going back to the beach after school with Tommy. All her chores for the day had fallen by the wayside. She could get to them when she felt more like it. After all, what were they going to do? Kick her out of the country? Suddenly, Angelica was thrust back into the present with a knock at the window. She opened her eyes quickly and looked out in the direction of the knocking sound. There was a face directly opposite hers on the other side of the glass. The face belonged to Javi Jones. "Let's get that coffee another time, shall we?" he said. Angelica wound down the electric window and asked, "What's happened here?" She wasn't sure he would give her any information, but she had to try. He said nothing in return. "I know Tina Gonzalez. If you don't help me, I'll find out anyway. It will be all over the playground by the end of the school day," she offered. "The mother has been killed. The father has been arrested. It's an open and shut case," he explained before heading off in the direction of his car. If it was an open and shut case, then why didn't it feel that way? Chapter 8. Angelica wasn't going to sort anything else that day. The vases had stayed in the shop. The parcels bound for the UK were still in the boot of her car, and she wouldn't make any inquiries about extending her stay in Spain. The fact that a death had occurred was the biggest distraction to her, and that death was close enough for her to reach out and touch. Dangerous, but exciting too. Angelica's desire for a more adventurous life had been fueled. She just had to know what was going on with Tina Gonzalez, even if it was for the sake of poor Freya. Going back through Facebook, Angelica made note of all the mutual friends shared by her and Tina. This wasn't a massive list. The names on there included people she was only connected to on social media. So she put a cross next to them and concentrated on the ones that she had seen in the flesh and had some sort of relationship with. Angelica focused on 3 names: Petra Kartova, Emma Reese, Mariana Mariano. These she was close enough to. She could pick up the phone and ask a few questions without raising too many ripples. As she sat and looked at the names, one stood out more than most. Petra and Tina had started a business together a few years earlier, selling fragrances online. Although the business had been sold on to someone else, the two remained friends as far as Angelica knew. She dialed and waited for the reply. "Hi, Angelica." "Hi, Petra. How's things with you?" "I'm good, thanks. You?" "Yes, pretty good. Is now a good time to talk?" Angelica asked. She wanted to cut to the chase and hoped Petra would be amenable to that. "That sounds ominous." "I wanted to ask you a few questions about Tina Gonzalez. I've heard a few things over the last few days. I wanted to speak to someone who knows her well." "That's me. I know her just about as well as anyone on the planet except for Freya and Dante." Angelica sighed at the name of the daughter. She would be without a parent if Tina was dead, and Dante was the killer. "How has she been?" Angelica asked. Then she remembered the advice her brother gave her. The inner detective came to the fore. She sealed her lips and waited for a response. If she filled the silence with noise, then Petra wouldn't be able to. 10 seconds later, Petra started to speak as she thought. "She's been acting a little strange recently. Tina was always the most reliable person I knew. She was always early, never even on time. If she said she would be there, then she would be there. I even met her once for a coffee where she'd ran the last mile and a half because her car had broken down. Tina was covered in sweat, but she couldn't let me down. That was the kind of person she was. And when I say was, that's what I mean. That was the old Tina. In the last few months she would be late. She would not turn up and sometimes simply wouldn't even return calls. I got so worried about her. Between you and I, money might be a factor. I know we didn't get as much for the business as she would have liked. I believe that she didn't turn up because she couldn't afford a coffee or even the petrol to get to the coffee shop. She changed her phone number I don't know how many times over the last few months. I guess that was linked to not paying the bills. My take on it at any rate. I thought you guys did well with the fragrance business, Angelica asked. We did for a time. When we sold it, the business was doing well. It's seasonal. Does great at Christmas, Valentine's, Mother's Day. But the rest of the year is so quiet you almost get no orders at all. We sold it. With the solicitor's fees and taxes, we walked away with a few thousand each. Not a lot for all that hard work. Certainly not enough to live off more than a month. Why'd you ask about Tina? Are you sitting down? Angelica asked. Yes. Then Angelica began to tell Petra all she knew. The comment from Freya. The call to the detective. The forensics van outside the home and Dante being led away from the property in handcuffs. Petra was audibly upset. Angelica gave her a few moments to compose herself before asking, Do you have any questions? No, but I do have one thing to say. In my view, Dante is no killer. He loved that woman with all his heart and soul. Petra, we don't know what someone is capable of, Angelica replied, thinking about her own life. Patty wasn't always violent. She wouldn't have got with him if he was. But over the course of a couple of years, his dark side came to the fore. Chapter 9. That evening was the one Angelica had rescheduled after the shock of events. Tommy and Angelica headed to the beach. He played in the sand until it was dark. She played with him, but her mind was on something completely different. Angelica couldn't get her mind off the words Petra said. Dante is no killer. He loved that woman with all his heart and soul. The next morning, she headed off to school. She'd tossed and turned all night. Something didn't feel right, and she couldn't put her finger on it. Angelica resolved to spend the day working out what happened to Tina. Tommy walked off with his friends. She started walking. It was something she did to help her thought process. The distraction of going for a walk unlocked something inside her head. Not thinking directly about a subject allowed the subconscious to get to work, bringing relevant information to the fore whilst pushing the irrelevant to one side. Angelica decided that a good walk would be the best way to start working out what had happened to Tina. Angelica looked left and right as she did the day before, but the day before she looked for Tina Gonzalez to see if she was okay. By this time, she knew wasn't okay. Far from it. Further along the street, towards the last of the cars associated with the school run, she saw two women talking animatedly. One of them, the one with her back to Angelica, was the mother of a kid in Tommy's class. The boy was called Jack or Jake or something else beginning with a J. He was a kid who turned up when he wanted. Tommy wasn't totally comfortable around the J kid. Angelica guessed that came from the way he was brought up. Jay's mother had short hair, shaved across the back. Probably a good cut for the summer heat about to come, Angelica thought. But she wore it all year round. She was only just over 5 foot tall, carrying some excess weight that made her look taller than she actually was. The woman opposite her was known for being a money lender at school. She'd approached Angelica in the past, offering to lend her a few €1,000 if she needed it. Angelica declined. The woman introduced herself as Karen. She had the name Frank tattooed on her right arm. She guessed that Frank was the husband. The reputation of Frank and Karen went before them. People didn't mess. Rumours suggested that people who borrowed and didn't pay took a beating or worse from one or the other of them. Angelica had never met Frank, but the size and shape of Karen was enough to frighten most. She was almost 6 foot tall, with a physique that reminded Angelica of the shot putters she saw win Olympic gold medals. One punch or a single kick would be enough to scare just about anyone to finding the cash as quickly as they could. Karen stepped forward and leaned her face eyeball to eyeball with Jay's mother. Angelica couldn't help but feel she needed some form of protection. She was around 30 yards away, but could see the anger on one face and feel the terror in the body language of the other. Angelica upped the pace and was close enough to intervene within 20 seconds. "What's going on here?" she asked. "Mind your own business," the reply came. But it wasn't from the person she expected. It was Jay's mother who had spoken up. Angelica guessed she didn't want her business on public display. By this time, Karen had turned around and was walking in the opposite direction at some speed. Obviously, she didn't want her business to be conducted in public view either. Angelica guessed that she usually got people one-on-one and in a private place. "Are you okay?" she asked. But it was apparent that Jay's mother didn't want to talk. She shrugged and crossed the street, not thinking clearly. A car screeched to a halt, sounding the horn. Jay's mother flipped the bird and kept walking. Angelica didn't like the confrontation. Something told her that it was about money. What else could it be about? Karen's reputation really did precede her. Angelica knew the person to speak to about deals like this. She didn't want to talk to this slimeball, but she felt she had little choice. She started walking. Her skin crawled. Chapter 10. Angelica arrived at the door of the solicitor/accountant for those who trod the line between legality and lawlessness in Javier. His presence was usually enough to make Angelica get as far away as possible. The things she did to right the wrongs in the world. She buzzed, expecting a secretary to appear and buzz her in, but there was no secretary in the office. Instead, she was treated to the head of Laredo Paredes, sticking out of the door at the back of the office to see who it was. She was sure he would open up. He always did when a woman arrived. He thought he was God's gift to the opposite sex, but his manner repulsed every woman he met. Laredo was in a good place. Angelica could see. His weight was under control. His drinking, too. He was working out. The muscles noticeable even under his shirt. This was when he was at his most dangerous, Angelica mused. Often, he let himself go and put on stones of weight. This was when he was in a bad way personally. But the fat slob Laredo became was easy enough to brush off and walk away from. The slimmer, fitter, stronger Laredo felt like he had more to offer the world, and as such, wasn't as easy to dismiss. He buzzed her in with a smile as wide as his face. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" he hissed between his teeth, the tongue flicking in and out as he spoke like a rattlesnake testing the air for prey. "Laredo, I have a few questions for you. Now, we both already know that you have the answers." "Well, I only exchange information. I don't give it out for free. What do you have in return for me?" Chapter 11. On the other side of town, a woman answered the door. She was expecting a package from Amazon delivered that day. Some new reading books to give her something to do. It was a luxury she could ill afford, but the credit card was a few euros under the limit, and it was better than going mad inside the four walls of her home. She'd not worked since the last summer, and the days grew boring, one merging into the next. But when she opened the door, she wasn't face to face with a happy Amazon delivery driver and a parcel. She was face to face with an angry woman who belted her in the face with her fist, drawing tears from her eyes and blood from her nose. "You already know what happens to people who don't pay," Karen said, aiming the second blow at her midriff. It took the wind out of her. "Isabella, you owe us close to $3,000, and you've had plenty of verbal warnings. This is your final verbal warning," Karen explained. The features on her face contorted as she grew more angry. The redness was a mix of sun exposure and the tension of dealing with a late payer. It was business to Karen up to a point. She was happy to lend to those who couldn't get cash from the bank, and she was happy to charge extortionate interest rates. After all, who was going to stop her? What would they do? Report it to the police? But when they didn't pay, it felt like a personal slight, and that made Karen angry. "Verbal?" Isabella asked. "It just so happens that the last verbal warning is also the first physical warning," Karen explained with a kick to the shins. Somehow that hurt more than the blows to the face and midriff. Isabella was still catching her breath, but had enough breath to cry out in pain. "I'll have your money soon," Isabella responded. "You have 1 week today until the next warning. You don't have the money for expensive dental work, so don't put yourself in a position where you're going to need it." Karen spoke before walking back down the path and away from Isabella's property. Karen smiled to herself as the redness ebbed away from her face. She'd been angry and let the anger out in the only way she knew how, inflicting pain on other people. Isabella walked back into her home. "Who was that, Mama?" her daughter asked. "Nobody, baby. It was for the wrong house," Isabella responded, covering her bloody nose with her hand while trying to regain her breath. She didn't want her daughter to know what was going on. "Go back to your colouring in. I'm just going to get washed," Isabella explained. Her daughter went back to the front room. The mother went upstairs and collapsed onto the bathroom floor. She wept there for 20 minutes before picking herself up and trying to regain her composure. Back downstairs, with the pain subsiding, she looked out of the window and saw a gleaming white Range Rover with tinted window, lowered suspension and electric blue lighting sat out the front. Chapter 12. "What do you want from me?" Angelica asked, immediately regretting the way she'd phrased it. She added a look that told Loredo that he'd better keep it clean. His open mouth closed again as he dug deep for a better answer than the one he was about to give. Loredo paused for far too long. Angelica knew he was flicking through indecent ideas in his head. Even though she wasn't party to his thoughts, she wanted them to stop. "Do you know about the killing of Tina Gonzalez?" she asked. "Tina who?" "Tina Gonzalez. At the moment, her husband is in custody. The police seem to think that they've got him banged to rights. He'll need legal representation if he's going to get off. Their home looks like it cost a pretty penny. Whoever gets him off the charges will be rewarded handsomely." "I went to school with her," Loredo spoke back with a glint in his eye that suggested only he knew what he was smiling at. "You went to school with who?" she asked. "Pretty Penny." "Loredo, that's lame, even for you." But he'd already moved on from his joke. He was part thinking about how he could get to be the legal representative of Tina Gonzalez's husband. If he was banged to rights, then the top solicitors in town wouldn't touch him. They attracted business by advertising their success rates. Taking on a case that they were bound to lose did nothing for their figures. But Loredo would take on any case. All he was interested in was the cash. Win or lose, that was the client's problem, not his. but his dodgy mind was working overdrive. There wasn't just the murder case, there would be a probate case, and that meant more cash. Laredo was plotting his way to earning cash from the demise of Tina Gonzalez one way or another, perhaps both. Yes, that's good information. I think I can answer your question now, he hissed again. His excitement at potentially lining his pockets had made him a happy man, and when Laredo was happy, his tongue loosened, but only a little. A loan shark operation, Angelica stated. What about it? Are you aware of the one in the town? Angelica asked. Which one? High end or lower end? Laredo replied with a question of his own. He wanted her to know that he had much more information than she'd asked for. Lower end, I'd guess. Angelica responded, knowing that she needed to get it right. If she asked the wrong questions, then he would want more from her, and she wasn't willing to give anything else to this slime ball. Well, you know, Javier is a seasonal town, he asked. Yeah? Well, the summer months are filled with cash. Tourists and Magdalenos flock here and drop money everywhere. The bars and restaurants are just the tip of the iceberg. Everybody gets their cut. Dealers have a much bigger client base. The puta clubs are full. Money washes away all the sins of the world. Huh, she responded. She didn't have the same attitude towards criminality as he did. But in the winter, people don't have access to the same cash. If they were sensible, then they would have a slice of their summer money to see them through the rest of the year, but they don't. In the summer, everyone lives like a movie star. In the winter, they all live like paupers. And that's when the moneylenders come into play. The lower end is run by two people. Of course, I can't give you their names. That's okay, I already know who they are, Angelica responded, assuming that it was Karen and Frank. Who else? Well, I think that's our time here done. Unless you can think of anything else to waste away a few minutes, he asked hopefully. Angelica was already on her feet and halfway to the door. No need to stick around. Chapter 13. Angelica walked around the port area, where Laredo's office was situated, for 10 minutes. She walked around in circles, letting her subconscious brain take over. She was sure that she had most of the pieces of the jigsaw, but maybe there were one or two missing. She walked aimlessly, and after a while she noticed that she was outside the same coffee shop that her, Augustine and Javi sat in at the back end of the year before. Angelica took a seat at the counter and nodded when the man behind the bar said, "Cappuccino." She didn't question at the time why he'd just assumed this. But later, when Angelica was laid in bed unable to sleep, she wanted to know what had prompted the assumption. Did he remember her from last time? Or did she give off all the signals that she was a cappuccino drinker? Did she look like she couldn't handle the strong stuff? Drinking the cappuccino with her thoughts still rumbling away under the surface, she was aware that someone else had entered the cafe. There were 4 seats at the counter. The new occupant of the room sat at the one next to her. She stared forward, concentrating on her drink while hoping the brain would subconsciously concentrate on everything else by not focusing on it at all. The male voice next to her was offered a café solo. Now that was a proper coffee, according to everyone in Europe except the British. She looked to her left and saw features that she recognised. Javi Jones was next to her. "Right place, right time," she said to herself under her breath. "Sorry?" he asked. "Nothing. How are you?" "Good," Javi replied. "And you?" "I'm good. Javi, I wanted to ask you about Tina. You know I can't talk about a case while we're investigating it.
Well, guess what? Angelica prompted.
You're already investigating it yourself?
How did you know? She asked.
It wasn't a coincidence that you were at Tina Gonzalez's home, and I know what you're like when you get the bit between your teeth. I can't be seen to encourage it, but I'm not going to put you off either. You're a big girl. You make your own decisions.
Angelica loved listening to Javi's voice. The mix of Spanish from his mother and Welsh from his father had produced a blend of the deep, rounded vowels of the Spanish and the sing-song Welsh twang. She'd certainly never heard anyone else speak like that.
He's not talking in the interview room. I've spoken to him for around 3 hours now in total. I ask questions, he sits there silently. I can't see him being charged with her murder.
What else can you tell me?
I can't tell you much.
Oh, she replied, disappointed. Chapter 14. Angelica finished her coffee with Javi. He seemed defeated with the case. If he had felt that he had his man, then she assumed he would seem much happier. But she had stuff to do herself. Angelica picked up the vases she hadn't bought the day before and walked back home. She had some research to do regarding her status in the country in the light of the UK leaving the EU. She thought about the things Laredo had told her when she was in his office. She didn't like the fact that drug dealers were walking the streets of Javier. Magellanos, people from Madrid, were blamed for many things in the town. It was used as a term of disdain by locals. Angelica didn't think that was fair. People came to Javier from all over Spain and all over the rest of the world too. Why lay the blame at the door of one group of people? And the putter clubs were another side of Spanish life she didn't like. As far as she had been told, they were adult clubs. But rumours were that the girls were there to do more than dance for the men. But she had enough on her plate to do something about that. Angelica would leave that battle for another day. With her new vases in pride of place and some information about residency, she went back to the school to pick Tommy up. He loved his school days, but was tired and ready for relaxation when he got back home. This didn't last long. A chill on the sofa and some food, and he was ready to run round again. Wednesday meant PE. He was more tired than usual. This was the day she took the car to pick him up. It was much easier than the potential tantrums on the walk home from school. "Mummy!" Tommy shouted. It was a chant that was repeated up and down the railings outside the school as mothers picked their children up from school. Angelica smiled at the feeling of love that abounded there. It gave her a warm feeling inside. The pair of them chatted about his school day while they walked back to the car. As she got him in, and then did the same herself, she spotted a flashy white Range Rover on the other side of the street. Tinted windows and lowered suspension meant that it could only belong to one person. A number plate, K4REN, confirmed this. In a split-second decision, Angelica decided to follow. "Mummy, where are we going? Home is that way," Tommy said from his position in the back seat.
Angelica was pleased that he'd inherited her sense of direction rather than that of his father. She hoped that he would have as little of Patty in him as possible, especially in the way he treated others. "I've got a couple of errands to run, Tommy. It won't be long."
"What are you doing?" he asked.
"Just wait and see," she responded. She didn't know at that point what the errands might look like, but she was sure that following Karen was the right thing to do. Tracking the car through the streets and up into the hills, Angelica knew the neighbourhood well. Her friends lived up in the hills, in mansions built off the back of their fabulously successful business careers or their inheritance. Angelica didn't feel at home there when she first drove up to the hills, but the more she did it,
the more comfortable she became. The car drove along the middle of the narrow streets like Karen owned them. If another car came round the same blind bend at the same speed with the same road positioning, then a head-on collision would be the only possible outcome. Angelica dropped back 50 feet or so, not wanting to be involved in any such accident. 3 minutes of wincing at every corner later, Angelica saw the gates of a property open and the Range Rover slip through. Karen didn't wait for the gate to fully open and nearly lost a wing mirror in the process of entering her own property. Angelica wondered how many times she'd have to spend a few €100 on a new wing mirror, but it was clear that Karen wasn't short of cash. The home was set back from the road, but it still imposed. It took up almost all of the view. Angelica slowed and watched Karen screech to a halt in front of her double front doors. Angelica looked in the rear-view mirror. There was nothing travelling up the road. Tommy was drifting into a sleep state due to the exertions of the day. When she looked back, the gates to the property were still open. Stood there with a hose in his hand was a pit bull of a man. His heavy-set upper body was littered with tattoos. His biceps were huge. Angelica had never seen such a pair of arms. The bald man stared right through her, but she was in no doubt what he was looking at. Angelica presumed this was Frank, and he was eyeballing her. Angelica drove away with Chapter 15. The next day, Angelica arose. It had been the first day of the year that she'd slept with the patio door to her balcony open. She had left it an inch or so open. In a few weeks, the door would be open fully, allowing the coolness of the night air to let her get off to sleep. She felt safe as the balcony was 4 floors up. Anyone wanting to get to her would have to climb into the patio garden of the duplex beneath her before scaling the walls. They would make that much noise that either her or the downstairs neighbour would have noticed and called the police long before they reached the top. It was like a renewal. The start of summer was the start of a new year as far as Angelica was concerned. The 1st of January wasn't when it all began for her. It was when the shoots of summer life began again. The town felt alive again with the activity of preparation. In her life, Angelica often found that preparation was better than the actual event. Like getting ready to go to the swimming pool. You anticipated warm water, loads of fun and splashing gently, but what you got was freezing cold water, dodging the plasters floating around the top of the pool, and feeling like a drowned rat by the end of it. But summer in Javier was as good as the preparation. Actually, even better. It was those long, hot, hazy days that promised so much and delivered it all, plus more. She looked through the gap in the curtains made by the slight breeze from the open door. The sky was nothing but blue. The heat would follow, but for now it was mid-teens. Not bad for that time of the morning. Tommy hadn't stirred. Angelica got around an hour to herself in the week before he got out of bed. Well, before she got him out of bed. She used this time to potter around the kitchen, tidying up from the night before if needed before getting things ready for the day. She wanted control over what Tommy ate at school, so she made him a packed lunch. That took a few minutes, as did emptying the dishwasher on alternate days. 2 of them didn't have enough dishes to make it a daily activity. She dragged herself from one side of her double bed to the other. She always started the night on the left of the bed and pretty much always woke up on the right. That meant she had to move to do things like turn off her alarm and check her phone. Angelica shuffled and then picked up her phone, turning it the right way from the face-down sleeping position she always chose. A message displayed on the phone. the movement awakening it. A tear formed in the corner of Angelica's eye. She saw only the first few words as previewed on her phone, not the whole message. It was another message of abuse. She'd had a few over the past year or so, but as it had been a few weeks since the last, she had mistakenly thought they had stopped. Angelica could handle the words herself. She had become numb to the symbolism used and nastiness they represented. But she couldn't help thinking of the impact on Tommy if the texter had his or her own way. She suspected Patty, Tommy's father, but he was still locked up in a UK prison. It made her mind wander to what Freya's life would look like going forward. The routine of the day happened without much thought. Angelica dropped Tommy off at school and drove her car to the old town. This was where the market happened. As she neared the centre of the market, traffic slowed. The number of people walking past increased hugely, and the smells of food and leather filled the air. Angelica slowly made her way to the underground car park. She sat in line beneath where the hustle and bustle of the market was happening. Looking up and down for a space, Angelica spotted the flash Range Rover a few spaces down. No matter who you were, old or young, rich or poor, and no matter what side of the law you lived on, Javier Market was a draw. Angelica smiled. Grabbing a few shopping bags with a mind on the fresh fruit and vegetables sold there, she walked to the stairwell that would take her swiftly to the surface. The underground car park had a coldness that she knew wouldn't be present when she got out into the sun. As she walked up the stairwell, it felt eerily quiet. Usually there were a handful of people paying for their parking at the machines situated on one of the landings, or a couple walking up the stairs, arguing about where they had parked the car. But on this day, nothing. The daylight from above and the lights of the car park behind were present as she made it to the first step, but they both disappeared in the same instant. Angelica looked around. A shadowy figure moved in the recess at the bottom of the stairs over her left shoulder. Patty? She thought to herself. The memory of the message from earlier in the day still large in her mind. The smell of almonds filled the air. The shadow stepped out into the light. It wasn't Patty. It was the man she saw at the house she followed the Range Rover to. It was Frank. As he stepped closer, still with a huge grin on his face, he shoveled a handful of almonds into his mouth from a brown paper bag. Angelica grimaced. Chapter 16. In the port area of town, Javi Jones sat with an incredibly strong cup of coffee and the forensic reports from the killing of Tina Gonzalez. He added hot water, milk, and sugar to the coffee. He wanted to try what Angelica had ordered at the cafe. Was this how the English had their coffee? No wonder they prefer a cup of tea. He had another file with him. This contained all of the verbal evidence gathered in the hours after discovering Tina's body, and the sum total of all this evidence was tallied up in one word: inconclusive. He hated that word. The forensic evidence didn't have a full cause of death. There was alcohol, and another as yet unidentified poison or toxin in her system. The full report would take another day or so. Interim reports always teased like this. Something told Javi he didn't really have that long. It was the first time he really called Dante's guilt into question. So Javi decided that his role at that point in time was to theorize who the killer might be if it wasn't Tina's husband Dante. Without knowing how she died, he couldn't conclusively know who killed her. But he could use his powers as a detective to come up with a short list of people in the event that Dante wasn't the man in the frame. One of the neighbours was a nasty piece of work. Javi had spoken to the guy personally. The man was a misogynist of the highest order. There was no wonder he lived on his own. But this man, called Grando by himself and others, knew the ins and outs of Tina's life as though he was living it himself. Grando's real name was Albo Gratita. He earned his nickname because it was close to the Spanish word for large. Grando was certainly that. By the sound of things, he sat in his front room watching the world go by with great interest. Grando was a shut-in, though. If he was anywhere near Tina's house, then he would have been spotted. He couldn't have got very far at all because of his size, his agoraphobia, and the fact that he was known right across the neighbourhood. He wouldn't have got more than a few steps from his front door without someone stopping him for a chat. The forensic report mentioned several pieces of DNA found in the property. There was the family, Tina, Dante, and Freya, but there were traces from at least 7 other sources. No reports of the family having any relatives close by, any friends visiting, or anyone coming into the home to carry out repairs. So that left 7 pieces of DNA unaccounted for. Far too many to build a case from. The answer needed to come from elsewhere. Another one of the reports from a neighbour suggested that Tina had a falling out with a business partner called Knocker. They had a stall together at the market in the old town. Things went well to begin with, and then not so well. It was more than a simple business going wrong. According to the reports, this was a massive falling out with accusations levelled by both sides. This was the type of thing that could turn ugly, but rarely did. Maybe Knocker was the person he needed to speak to next. He left. Chapter 17. Do you know who I am? My guess is that you are Frank, Angelica responded. Your guess is correct, clever girl. Why were you following my wife? Frank asked, looking Angelica in the eye as he still munched on almonds. Angelica thought about running, but assumed that the light being cut off at the top of the stairs was one of Frank's cronies. He seemed menacing, but calm, and she'd rather he stayed calm. Your wife? Yes, I saw you yesterday outside my home. Your car was right behind Karen. Oh, I remember you. I saw you yesterday. Was that your home? Oh, it's lovely. Are you selling? What? Frank asked. Are you selling? You see, I'm looking up to be in the hills to be near my friends. I was up there yesterday looking to see if there were any for sale. I'm registered with all the estate agents, but sometimes a property comes up that even the agents don't know about, doesn't it? I'm not sure, Frank replied, confused as to why the conversation wasn't going the way he wanted it to. Angelica had thought on her feet and put him off the scent. The door at the bottom of the stairwell was rocking, the handle rotating as people tried to get from the car park to the market. It was their weekly pilgrimage. They would walk through walls to get to it. Well, if you hear of anything, then let Karen know. I see her at the school every now and again. Righto, Frank responded. But if I come to my front gate again and find you sitting there, I won't be held responsible for what happens. Do I make myself clear? Is that a warning, Frank? Are you going to break my legs? Angelica asked, feeling bolder by the second. What was he going to do? People would probably break the door down in a few seconds. You couldn't keep the retired away from the market for long. I don't break legs as a warning. There is no warning. You get on the wrong side of me and you're as gone as these almonds, he responded, shaking the bag. Now, do I make myself clear? Clear as daylight, Angelica replied, looking up to see if the daylight from the market above had returned. Nothing at that point in time. And if you need to borrow any cash for your new home, please, let me know," Frank finished as he slipped back into the Chapter 18. Javi headed to the market in the old town to see Noca Velez. She had been a long-time Javier resident and was known in the market. All he had to do was ask. The traffic on the way to the market was heavy. Javi pulled his car into a parking space over a mile away and set off on foot. Javi had been neglecting the physical side of his well-being for a while. A regular runner, swimmer, cyclist and walker, he had barely left the sofa after work for a month. There was just something blocking him from getting out there and getting on with it. He had no idea what that might be, just that he needed to make a change. He got like this every now and again. Work life was heavy. The oncoming summer, when the number of people in the town swelled, was just around the corner. He needed a break, to recharge the batteries. Javi resolved to bring this case to a swift conclusion and then take some time away. He had no idea where he wanted to go, but wherever it wasn't Javier. 2 weeks without thinking about the place he lived and worked in would do him the world of good. 10 minutes hard walking later, and he was on the edge of the market. It was a pleasant stall, the edges framed with purple flowers Javi recognised but couldn't name for the life of him. They reminded him of a friend's garden. He loved the way beautiful gardens looked, but didn't have the patience to make them look that way himself. He took a travel-sized can of deodorant from the pocket on his sleeveless jacket and sprayed his underarms. It wasn't that he's forgotten to shower, just the sweat he'd worked up on the walk over. And in Javi's book, nobody wanted to smell that. He watched a few customers come and go. The leather goods that she sold were handled and smelled before the haggle over the price began. He loved the gentle haggling that happened in the markets in Europe. He tried it when visiting his father's family in Wales once and got knocked back. He was told that the price shown was the price paid. Javi much preferred the Spanish way of doing things. He approached. "¿Qué?" she asked. "Noca?" he replied. "Yes," she responded, slipping into English. Noca was from Italy and spoke pretty good Castilian, but she recognised a British lilt to Javi's voice and took that as an opportunity to speak in a language she was far more comfortable with. Although she was born in Perugia and moved to Javier in her school years, most of her friends at school and college were English. Javier wasn't always as cosmopolitan as the present day, so back when Noca arrived in the town, the foreigners stuck together. They didn't have any ties except for the fact they weren't Spanish. The Spanish kids were in a clique, and the non-Spanish formed one of their own. Noca learned English from 2 sources: hanging out with her mates and watching American television. As such, she spoke in an accent that was mixed between Cockney and American. "My name is Javi Jones. I'm with the local police. Can I ask you a few questions?" "Is this about Tina?" Noca replied instantly. She had heard through the grapevine that her one-time friend had been killed. She kind of expected a visit from the police at some stage. "Yes. Then you'd better come over here," she replied, pointing to a concrete area at the back of her stall, asking the stall holder next to her if she'd mind keeping an eye out. They worked together. The market was like that. Noca pointed to a chair in the corner that looked like it had seen better days. Much better days. Javi gave it the once-over, worrying that it wouldn't have the strength to support him. It wasn't the only thing in his presence that had seen better days. According to the police record system, Noca should have been in her 40s, but she looked at least 60. Her hair had greyed completely. Bags under her eyes were the result of more than just a few sleepless nights, and the colour of her skin was pallid, almost the same grey as her hair. Javi sat in the chair. Even though he didn't carry much excess weight, he must have been twice the mass of the woman who was shifting herself downwards awkwardly into the chair opposite. He was still worried about the ability of the chair to support him, so he perched on the edge, where there was more wood and less fabric. I'd heard she was dead. I can't say that I'm sorry or say that I'm far behind her. I never got the chance to tell her how I wished it had turned out differently when she was alive. If I see her in the afterlife, I'll make it up to her then, Knocker exclaimed. Javi didn't feel the inclination to ask what was happening to her. There were a few telltale signs by the way one side of her body was stiff, unmoving. He'd seen the signs of a stroke in his family in the past. His great-aunt suffered in the same way, and from experience, he knew what was next for Knocker. She would get older, look older as though she was on some kind of age acceleration. The aneurysms in her body were a ticking time bomb. One day soon, one of them would pop, and she would be finished. And what was your relationship with Tina like? Javi asked, staring at the beginning. He could hear that things weren't great, but he wanted to know more detail. We had a business together. This market stall. Tina was great at speaking to the customers, a real charmer. And I have all the contacts we'd ever need to source the best leather goods at the cheapest price. It was a match made in heaven. Not that she'll be going to heaven. And what happened? Javi asked, trying his best to ignore the bitterness in her voice. He knew that the last few steps towards the grave could bring a negativity that nobody could explain. She ran out of money. She asked me to buy out her half of the business. I offered what I thought was a fair price. She wanted to double it. There wasn't double that in the business. We do well, but we're only a market stall with a small presence online. It's not like we're Amazon. The negotiations got ugly. We fell out. I suppose you've already heard that I threatened to have her killed, Knocker asked. I've had no idea, Javi responded. Then why are you here? To ask questions, find out what I can, Javi replied, seeing that her strength wasn't up to much more questioning. He had no idea how she would be able to keep the stall operating for a few more hours, let alone pack it all up when the trade subsided. So ask, she said. Do you have any idea why she needed the money? Javi asked, with two thoughts in his head. The first one was that Tina and Dante lived in a lovely home. The second was some of the credit card statements he'd glossed over in the reports showing tens of thousands of euros worth of debt. He couldn't reconcile the two thoughts. She definitely came over as desperate for cash, that's for sure. Aside from that, I can't say I know a great deal about her life. We worked together, but we were never friends as such. We got on and then we fell out. And the threat to have her killed? Just my mouth running away with me. When I was younger, fitter, healthier, I let my anger get the better of me. Now I still feel the anger, but there's not a great deal I can do about it, so I just let it slide, Knocker explained. Chapter 19. Javi thanked Knocker for her time and told her not to leave the country. He could see that she wasn't going anywhere at all. If he was forced to guess, he gave her a couple of months at the most. Finished with Knocker, Javi was deciding whether to walk back to his car or get another coffee to replace the one in his office he didn't get the time to drink. As he walked from the market downhill towards the wider roads, he spotted a woman he believed to be Angelica from a distance. Javi followed, weaving his way through human traffic in an attempt to catch her up and maybe make up for the coffee they didn't get to drink together. He wasn't having much luck with finishing coffees. She walked almost as quickly as he did, going through the quieter streets. Javi wasn't making much impact on the gap between them, apologizing for bumping shoulders with people every few seconds. Every time he felt like he was making ground up, She disappeared behind a car, a person, a market stall, only to reappear further away than ever before. At the bottom of the street, she would have a choice to walk up the hill towards the post office, straight over to more market stalls, or right to a quieter part of the old town. She turned left. Javi saw this as his chance to catch her up. The traffic was busy there, but the people thinned out as the shops absorbed some of the crowd. Javi reached the end of the road and looked left so he could calculate how far Angelica was away from him. Chapter 20. Angelica woke up. The darkness was all-consuming, taking away her ability to see where she was. There was nothing but unfamiliarity around her. Angelica rubbed her head, wondering how she had ended up where she was. Those first few seconds when she woke up always took Angelica by force, thrusting her into a mental place that undermined all of her confidence in life. These were when she was the most vulnerable. Angelica hated feeling vulnerable, but she knew it was part of life. Putting herself in dangerous situations was a small window into the life her brother Augustine lived. She wanted a piece of that life. Angelica was starting to learn that you couldn't have a small piece of a life like that. It was all or nothing. You couldn't just take a time out and walk away. The demons that you investigate followed you. Timeouts didn't exist. She reached into her pocket for her phone, clicking the button for the torch. Immediately, she knew where she was. The new blackout curtains in the living room had turned it from a familiar place to an unfamiliar. Angelica's heart slowed to a pace more in keeping with her usual. She rubbed her eyes again, this time taking in all that was around her. The old curtains needed to be replaced. She had put it off for months before. The new ones made the room completely dark. The old ones were threadbare, showing more light than dark. Angelica had inherited the old ones from whoever owned the place before, and when she moved in, cash was an issue, so she kept everything that was left behind. But now things had gotten more secure. She felt able to loosen the purse strings and spend some cash on things like blackout curtains. She stood up and felt groggy, like she'd been out for a drink the night before. Angelica didn't drink to oblivion any longer. When she was with Patty, drinking copious amounts of alcohol helped her forget the miserable life he inflicted on her. Since she'd walked out on the guy, Angelica only drank with friends and family, and only ever a few. She stumbled back to a sitting position and shook her head to clear it. Angelica used the furniture to guide herself to the kitchen, opened the window wide, and poured herself a drink of water from the fridge. The fresh, cold liquid made her feel like the grogginess would subside. She walked upstairs for a shower. She had to get herself back in a good place. She was due to pick Chapter 21. Angelica walked from her home to the Arenal. She decided that she wouldn't risk driving when she still had some of the grogginess in her system. The cold water of the drink was followed by cold water of a shower. Between them, they had helped her feel like she was ready for the rest of the day, but not enough to drive a car around all those kids and to ferry the precious cargo of her only child. Angelica wanted to walk off the effects of whatever had made her feel that way. In the past, she had felt like this when a heavy cold or flu was just about to strike, but it didn't feel like that. It was like an intoxication. The only things she'd had to eat since breakfast were the cherries from the market. Angelica wondered what those farmers were putting on their crops. She walked as quickly as her head would allow, working her way through the possible explanations. Drink? No, haven't had those in a few months. Drugs? Well, No, not when I have a child in my care. Food poisoning? Unlikely. Not much chance of catching from cornflakes and milk. Something in the air. Again, unlikely. If it was then, we'd all be feeling the same way. I'd be walking down a street of people all holding their heads. The flu doesn't feel like any flu I've had before. As Angelica walked and thought, she passed by shops, cafes, bars and restaurants, all doing their thing. Bars were getting ready for the evening trade. It had been a sunny enough day that day, would be out that evening grabbing the last of the sun after work, then grabbing a drink or two in the evening air. The shops were open, but trade was slack. Angelica knew that these survived with what they did in the months to come. The rest of the year was just ticking over on skeleton staffing. The cafes and restaurants did well all year round. There were enough people with enough money to make a living 365 days a year, the summer months being the cherry on top. Angelica walked past a charity shop and looked at the white plastic stand that contained DVDs. Angelica was on the lookout for something new to watch. She didn't subscribe to cable TV, and the Spanish channels were too much for her grasp of the language. It was pretty much her DVD player that gave Angelica access to anything to watch on the box. She spun it round and looked at the movies. Angelica was a bit of a movie buff, and she didn't mind paying €1 or $2 for a DVD and then giving it back to charity after a few watches. The movies on the stand didn't really float her boat, until she saw Fight Club. Angelica recited lines from films she had seen repeatedly to her friends on the phone and over social media. The one quote from Fight Club that always came to her mind when she saw the image of Edward Norton and Brad Pitt with a bar of soap in his hand was, "One can make all kinds of explosives using simple household items." But what about poisons? She asked herself, blushing as a passer-by turned their head at the comment. As she said it to herself over and over in her head, Angelica had a brainwave. She did some research on her phone. Her brain went into overdrive, putting all the pieces together from her experiences over the past few days. She researched a website on her phone, clicking away at the details like they would be wiped clear seconds later. Angelica found what she wanted, and then turned her phone to another use. Javi? Chapter 22. "Where are we going?" Javi asked. Angelica's head had cleared in an instant when she saw a line of information on the website. She ran back to collect her car and then pulled up on the curb outside the police station. Javi was already sat outside, waiting for Angelica to collect him. He didn't know what she was referring to, but knew that she meant business. It was evident in her voice. "It's better if I show you rather than tell you," Angelica explained, concentrating on the road. She'd contacted a friend to ask if they would pick Tommy up if she wasn't at school on time. Her and Delia did these kind of favours for each other every now and again. "Okay," were the only words Javi used in reply. He didn't like not being in control, but was willing to go with her on this one. Minutes later, they were up in the hills overlooking Javier. She pulled up at the front of a familiar house. The gates were open. She left her car in between them, stopping any other vehicle getting in or out. She was determined to get to the bottom of this, and she needed Javi there for 2 reasons: to offer protection and to arrest whoever it was she hopefully revealed as the killer. She walked up and down, looking at the exterior of the property for something in particular. But Angelica didn't know exactly what that thing in particular was. She just hoped that she would instinctively know it when she saw it. She walked up and down, looking high and low like a child who'd been sent to find something, and wanted anyone watching to know that they were making an effort. As Angelica looked, an item glistened in the sun from beneath a shrub. The spindly stalks on the bush had left enough space for sunlight to get through. "Javi, come here," she instructed. It was the evidence she had suspected. She didn't think it would be this easy. Looking up at the house, she could see that the kitchen window was overhead. She imagined the perpetrator throwing this bottle of arsenic out when they had finished with it, not expecting anyone to come snooping around. "What is it?" Javi asked before seeing the same glistening and spotting the label on the bottle. He had seen these before. His brother worked in metals, mixing alloys with arsenic. He immediately knew this was the cause of death of Tina Gonzalez, a fact the toxicity reports would later confirm. They looked at the bottle. Then suddenly, the sunlight faded. There was something blocking the sun from getting through. It was the frame of a large man. The menace was obvious. Angelica and Javi turned around. They didn't like. Chapter 23. The next instant, Javi received a blow to the head that sent him spiralling across the garden in the direction of the arsenic bottle. He managed to direct his fall, so he missed the bottle. Javi tried to stand up, but a kick to the ribs took the wind out of him and sent him further into the garden, this time in the middle of the lawn. He looked up and saw Frank stood over him with a stick in his hand. Javi looked to move one way and then the other, but found that his movements were anticipated and blocked by the large man. His exits were none. He feared for his life. The man raised the stick. Javi waited. But Angelica didn't. She grabbed a handful of ivy from the garden, ripping it from its roots, bundling it into a ball. She jumped on Frank's back and thrust the ivy into his face. He stumbled back, dropped the stick to relieve the intense itching in his face. Javi jumped to his feet and helped Angelica take the man to the ground. Within seconds, the cuffs were on, and Frank was under control. Javi Jones called for a police car to come and collect him. "How did you know?" Javi asked as he sat with the man. Frank knew the game was up and that he would be in even more trouble if he resisted arrest. He believed that if he got himself a good lawyer, then he might be able to wangle his way into a short prison sentence. A career criminal knew when to fight something and when to take a step back. This was the time to take a step back. The smell of almonds. Frank was eating almonds when I saw him in the market earlier, and then I was inspired by a quote from Fight Club to do a bit of research. Nobody I've spoken to thought Dante was guilty, and I had such a strong feeling he was innocent that I started looking at the alternatives. There were money issues, and this guy lends money to people. He doesn't give warnings if he gets involved. Isn't that right, Frank? "Whatever you say, lady," was Frank's response. He knew he was bang to rights. The arsenic would match the toxicology reports, and one of the 7 DNA samples in the home would belong to Frank. He wasn't going to beat his way out of this one. "I'm going to get Tommy from school now. Meet later?" Angelica asked Javi. The detective smiled. "How about you spend some time with Tommy tonight and I'll give you a call tomorrow? I'm sure you'll want to see your boy. And this guy will give me a mound of paperwork." Angelica nodded, then removed her car from the entrance to the property. She passed the police car on its way up the hill, sirens blaring, tires screeching. She knew that Tina Gonzalez would have justice. Chapter 24. The next day, Angelica and Javi met at Naray to start the interrupted coffees from a few days earlier. "How do you work these things out?" Javi asked. It wasn't that he couldn't do it himself, more that he was always looking for new ways to carry out his job. It was one of the worst parts of his job as far as he was concerned. As soon as he got to the rank of murder detective, all the training stopped. It was like he had already achieved, and that there was nothing left they could teach him. But Javi Jones saw lessons everywhere he looked. I really don't know. It comes together. I don't push it. I let it all mill around inside my head, and then something happens. It's like a light bulb switching on, but I'm not at the switch. And when the light bulb moment happens, are you thinking about the case? Are you delving deep into the facts? Javi asked with an intensity that she'd seen in him before. It was his work look. No, that's the thing. I'm not thinking about it at all. It's like I need to let the subconscious do its thing. I think about something else completely. I might call you again when I need help with the case, Javi said with a cheeky smile, the intensity gone. He raised his coffee cup to his lips and sipped. It wasn't what he was used to. Angelica had ordered this time. Javi had a cappuccino. Angelica licked her lips at the sweetness of the drink. She'd gone for one with a gingerbread syrup in, and hadn't anticipated the concentration of the sugary syrup. I might just take you up on that. Like what you've listened to? The Valentine's Mystery, the next instalment of the Angelica Boyle series, is available soon. Listen to the first chapter now. The Valentine's Mystery. Chapter 1. We're all going, Delia said to Angelica. It was the Valentine's marked ball, the February social highlight in Javier. Anyone who was anyone would be there. All of Angelica's friends went. In fact, they went to any and every social occasion. It was part of being the in crowd in the town. I'm not sure. What about Tommy? Angelica asked, brushing her hand through her long brown hair, a sure sign that she was nervous. Angelica had a few tells. This was her most obvious. So obvious that even Delia noticed it. And Delia barely noticed anything that anyone else did. She was so wrapped up in her own life. And what a life, Angelica often thought. He's too young to come. Maybe in a few years, Delia responded mockingly, trying to shame her friend into coming along. Angelica didn't want to turn up and be left on her own while her friends mixed with the great and good of Javier. Where is it? For the 15th time! It's at Cala Clements, a beautiful place where I've been to many weddings. It's usually a wedding venue, but on February the 14th it will be the venue for the biggest social event so far this year. And I think that you would be a fool to miss it. What if the future love of your life was in attendance and you missed him because you decided to sit at home and watch a movie you've already seen 10 times before? Okay, that was it. Those were the 2 letters Delia needed to hear. She had cracked the nut. Delia knew that as soon as Angelica committed to something, it was a done deal. And the letters O and K were a committal as far as Delia was concerned. Right, we're meeting at 8. I know it's early for Spain, but then we can get good seats, mingle a bit and get loaded. Delia enthused. Angelica liked the sound of an early start, because that meant an early finish. But there was no chance she'd get loaded, as Delia put it. She didn't drink much at all, and she'd heard rumours about the Valentine's masked ball. And in case you've heard the rumours, there's nothing to be concerned about at the event. We go there every year. I've been there every year since I was 16, and I've never seen anything but people having a good time. You do want to have a good time, don't you, Ange? But no buts, no problems. Nothing but us having a bit of fun. You deserve that, Delia uttered with a finality that Angelica recognised. The tone indicated that it was conversation over. She had heard that tone from her father all her life. She had even detected it in the voice of her son Tommy from time to time. The conversation stopped. Angelica was left with nothing but her thoughts. Her first thought was, why is a wedding venue available for a masked ball on Valentine's Day? Surely if it was that good a wedding venue, then it would have been booked months ago for a wedding. Don't people still get married on Valentine's Day? Angelica wondered if it could be that she wasn't the only one in the beautiful town of Javier that was finding love difficult. You're going to the masked ball again this year? Yeah, you know me. I go every year. I get what I want every year. But what do you want? A woman. No, that's not what you want. It is. You know plenty of women. I know plenty of women. Do you want one of them? Not on Valentine's. I could find you a woman. A woman who will beat you and hurt you. A woman who will bleed your bank account dry. A woman who will break you and leave you. Now, do you still want a woman? What's the alternative? A man? No, you're not getting the point. And I think you're doing it deliberately. You say you want a woman. That's far too generic. There are 4 billion of them on the planet. Some are too young, some too old. Some of them live too far away. A big chunk of them are already in happy relationships. Some aren't ready for a relationship right now. There are so many reasons why you don't just want a woman. And while you're wrapped up in just wanting a woman, any woman, you'll never find the right one. And you're some kind of expert, are you? It seems I'm more of an expert than you. Well, I don't care what you have to say. I'll be going to the masked ball, and I'll be taking my trusty rehypnol. If I can't find a woman to spend the night with me on Valentine's by fair means, then I'll find one another way. You're an animal. Thank you.